Every Sunday morning, without fail, the old man arrived at the park just after sunrise. He wore the same denim jacket, a little too big on his shoulders now, and carried a small wooden toolbox in one hand. In the other, a folded blue blanket. His steps were slow, not from injury, but from memory, as if each footfall passed through something invisible. The bench stood beneath an old oak tree near the pond, just slightly off the main walking path, a place most people passed without much thought. But to him, it was the center of the world. He would lay the blanket beside him, open the creaking box, and begin the ritual. Tightening bolts that were already tight. Sanding edges that had long been smooth. Replacing screws that didn't need replacing. Passers-by watched him with a mix of curiosity and mild amusement, assuming he was just another lonely old man with a fixation. Some would greet him politely, others avoid eye contact. He never said much, only nodding once in acknowledgement, returning to his task with a quiet intensity. What they didn't see, what they couldn't know, was that every motion had weight, every fix a prayer. The bench was more than wood and metal. It was a monument, a meeting point frozen in time. Years ago, on a similar morning, he had sat there with his son. They had argued. Not loudly, but with the cold edges of words that cut deeper than shouts. The boy, 18, maybe 19, stood up suddenly, his jaw tight, his eyes wet with frustration, and said he couldn't do it anymore. That he needed space. That he was leaving. The man had reached out to stop him, but it was too late. That was the last time he ever saw him. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The police report filed. A few false sightings. And eventually, nothing. A silence that filled every room in the house like fog. He had gone on living, if it could be called that. Retired early. Stopped going out. Stopped talking. Except for Sundays. On Sundays, he came to the bench. At first, just to sit. Then, as the bench began to weather with time, he brought tools. He couldn't fix what was broken inside him, but he could fix the bench. It gave him something to do with his hands. It gave him a reason to return. Over time, the bench became part of the park's landscape, always in pristine condition, more well-kept than the others. A few regulars even began referring to it as his bench. Still, no one asked why. They didn't see the way his fingers lingered over the wood. They didn't notice the small initial he had carved in the underside of the bench, just a single letter, J. They didn't know he sometimes whispered, "I'm sorry," as he worked. One Sunday, a little girl approached while he was sanding. She pointed at the box and asked what he was doing. He looked up, startled by the sound of her voice, and managed a gentle smile. "Just fixing it," he said. "But it's not broken," she replied. He paused. Some things still need care even if they don't look broken. Her mother called her away, and he returned to his work. That night, it rained. Hard. Wind tore through the trees and left branches scattered across the path. But by dawn, he was back, sweeping leaves from the bench, drying it with an old towel. A few bolts had loosened from the storm. He tightened them slowly, reverently. The sun broke through the clouds as he ran his hand across the backrest. That day, he stayed longer than usual. Something was different. He could feel it. A faint tug in the air. A sound that made him lift his head. But it was just the wind. He sat in silence for a long time, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photo. Cracked edges. Faded color. His son, standing beside him near the pond, both of them smiling. He placed it carefully on the bench beside him, looked at it for a moment, then put it back into his jacket. Before he left, he did one final check of the screws. And then, for the first time in years, he walked home without looking back. But the bench stayed with him, every grain, every screw, every memory etched into its surface. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he whispered his son's name, hoping that somewhere, somehow, it would reach him. The following Sunday came as all the others had before it, quiet and slow, with the park still soaked from the night's dew and the birds barely awake in the trees. The old man arrived at his usual time, toolbox in one hand, the photo of his son tucked carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. Something about the morning felt off. The air was still, heavier than usual, as if waiting for something. He sat down on the bench and stared at the wood for several minutes before even opening his box. His hands hovered over the tools but didn't reach for any. Instead, he pulled out the photo and stared at it, his eyes tracing the outline of the young face beside him, the same face that haunted his dreams for years, the same face that made him come back again and again. He spoke to the photo under his breath, just as he had 100 times before. "I don't know if you can hear me, son. But I'm still here. I never stopped looking for you." A jogger passed by and glanced in his direction but said nothing. The man put the photo away and slowly began his routine, checking the bolts, sanding the seat, brushing away imaginary dust. But his movements lacked the usual rhythm. They were slower, distracted. He kept looking down the path, toward the tree line, toward the corner of the park where visitors entered. Then he stopped completely. A man stood by the trees, not close enough to see clearly, but near enough to notice. He wore a hooded sweatshirt and dark pants. He wasn't moving. Just watching. The old man squinted but didn't say anything. The figure turned and disappeared behind the trees. He dismissed it as nothing, just a passerby, but something unsettled him. That night, sleep was hard to find. He tossed and turned, and when he did sleep, he dreamed. In the dream, his son sat next to him on the bench, older now, with eyes that knew too much and a face that carried time like a burden. They didn't speak, just looked at each other. The next morning, he returned to the park earlier than usual. The bench looked untouched, exactly how he had left it, but there was something else, an envelope, plain and folded once, placed directly in the center of the seat. He looked around quickly. No one. He picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside, a piece of lined paper with just a few words written in rough handwriting, "Still remember. Every day." There was no name, no signature, just that. He sat down, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Was someone mocking him? But no, something in those words felt real. Felt familiar. He folded the paper and placed it in his jacket next to the photo. All day, he thought about the message. The way it was worded. The handwriting. There was a curve in the R that reminded him of how his son used to write birthday cards. The capital D shaped like a triangle. Could it really be from him? No, he told himself. That's not possible. But he kept returning to that thought, to the feeling in his chest that said not to let go just yet. He came back the next day. And the next. Nothing. On Thursday, another note appeared. "Do you still go every Sunday?" It was placed carefully on the bench, not taped, not weighted down. Just sitting there as if it had grown from the wood itself. He didn't know whether to feel fear or hope. He wrote a reply that night, "Yes. Every Sunday. I never stopped." He placed it on the bench early the next morning and waited. Hours passed. Nothing. But the note disappeared. That pattern continued for days. New messages. Small exchanges. Never more than a few words. Never a name. "I remember the photo. I kept the stone from the creek. Do you still eat those peppermints?" With each message, the old man felt his hope grow and fear twist. Was he being played? Was his mind creating something out of grief? He couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. He lived for the notes now. One evening, after leaving a letter with more questions, "Where are you? Who are you?" He waited behind a tree after sunset. The park grew dark. Streetlights buzzed. Then, movement. A man in a gray hoodie approached the bench. Slowly. Cautiously. He reached down and picked up the letter. The old man stepped forward. "Wait," he called, his voice cracking from lack of use. The man froze. Slowly, he turned. They locked eyes. The old man gasped. Even in the low light, even behind the stubble and wear of time, even under the hood, he knew. It was him. His boy. Older. Thinner. Haunted. But alive. The man didn't speak. Just stood there, trembling. The old man took a step forward. "Jason?" The younger man's lips parted. His eyes welled. "Dad." The word came out in a breath, like it had been trapped for a decade. The old man stumbled forward, and they embraced. Neither spoke. The years of silence between them collapsed in that one moment. The bench stood quietly beside them, like a witness that had waited just as long. And beneath the wood, the small carved J smiled in the shadows, unseen by anyone, but always remembered. The morning after their reunion, the bench looked different, though not a single board had changed. The man who had returned, Jason, sat quietly beside his father, both of them watching the same tree their eyes had passed over countless times, only now together. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was patient, like an old friend who knew how to wait. The old man, who had spent years talking to ghosts, now had his son's voice beside him, and he didn't know where to begin. Jason broke the quiet first, his voice hoarse like it hadn't been used in years. "I didn't think you'd still be here." His father turned to him and smiled. "I never left. I kept fixing this bench because I didn't know what else to fix." Jason nodded, hands in his lap, eyes downcast. "I couldn't write. I couldn't call. I didn't think I was worth saving." The old man shook his head, placing a hand gently on Jason's shoulder. "You don't have to explain, son. You're here. That's enough." Over the next days, they met again and again at the same bench. Jason told him fragments of what had happened, how after deployment, he'd been taken, lost to a system that failed to find him, left broken and ashamed. How he had wandered from one place to the next, barely surviving, until one night a newspaper article about a man who fixed the same bench every Sunday caught his eye. There hadn't been a name in the article. Just a blurry photo of the man, kneeling with a wrench in hand, the outline of a photo just visible in his jacket. But Jason had known instantly. He had cut the article out and carried it for weeks before he built the courage to return. "I thought maybe I was imagining things," he admitted. "But then I saw the photo again, tucked in your jacket, and I knew it was real." The old man chuckled, shaking his head. "You always had a dramatic sense of timing." Jason smiled faintly, a ghost of the boy he used to be. That Sunday, for the first time in years, they sat together as the sun climbed higher, their shadows stretching across the park path. Passers-by noticed. Some smiled. Others whispered. A few recognized Jason from his years of absence, but no one approached. The bench didn't creak that day. It seemed stronger somehow, as if it too had waited for this reunion. Jason pointed to the carving on the wood, just a small J, faded and half-worn from time. "I made that the day before I left," he said. "I knew you'd keep coming back here. I just didn't think I'd ever come back with you." They began meeting every Sunday. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes Jason brought tools and helped, sanding or tightening bolts. Together they maintained the bench not because it needed fixing, but because they did. The bench became a symbol for others too. A small plaque appeared one morning, nailed discreetly to the side, in honor of all who wait, and all who find their way back. They didn't know who had placed it there, but they left it. People in the community began leaving small things, a flower, a folded note, a thank you card. They never stayed long. The old man and his son respected the quiet. One day, Jason brought a young boy with him. "This is Daniel," he said nervously. He's mine." The old man stared at the boy, who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes and the same dimpled smile his son used to have. "He's your grandson," Jason added softly. The old man's voice caught in his throat. He reached out a hand, and Daniel took it without hesitation. "I never thought I'd get to meet you," he said to the boy, blinking back tears. Daniel tilted his head. "Why?" The old man laughed through the emotion. "Because sometimes life hides its gifts. But they always find a way home." After that, the three of them came together on Sundays. Daniel brought his own small tools, plastic ones, and mimicked their movements. The bench had never been in better shape. With time, Jason found his footing again. He got help, spoke at local events, told his story of survival and reunion. The bench became known as the one that waited. Local papers ran articles, and families came to see it. But for the old man, it was never about the attention. It was about the moment he could sit beside his son and know he was safe. Years passed. The seasons changed. One winter morning, the bench sat alone again. Jason was out of town, and the old man arrived like always, now slower, his steps careful. He sat with a long sigh, placed a hand on the armrest, and closed his eyes. The cold didn't bother him. He opened his jacket and pulled out the same old photo. But next to it now was a newer one, Jason, Daniel, and himself, sitting side by side on the bench. "I did okay," he whispered. "You came back. That's all I ever wanted." A woman walked past, glanced at him, then looked again. She hesitated, then approached. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the man who fixes the bench?" He smiled. "Used to be. Now I just keep it company." She smiled back, placed a small flower on the seat, and walked away. He sat a while longer, then slowly stood, groaning with effort. As he turned to leave, he looked back one more time. "Take care of them," he said to the bench. And somehow, he knew it would. Years later, Daniel would bring his own son there, and tell him about the bench that never gave up. The one that waited. The one that healed. And each time he sat there, he felt the memory of hands, old and steady, keeping everything together, one bolt at a time.